Thank you. Fine for sound? Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Very, very nice to see you, and very glad, very welcome to be here at Google's headquarters, having come all the way from Turin in Italy, where I live and work and write, to tell you a little bit about my latest book, which came out, in fact, just last week in paperback. The Third Reich is Listening: Inside German Codebreaking, 1939 to 1945. We've all heard, particularly all of you who probably know more about this subject than I ever will, and certainly when you ask questions will prove to be far more interesting than most things I'll probably say to you. This is a subject that's been around, and we've heard, all of us, a lot about how the British decrypted codes used on the Enigma machine. We've seen the film The Imitation Game, where Keira Knightley and Benedict Cumberbatch save the world and save Europe and crack Enigma. And for 40 years, since the mid-1970s, when Enigma and the story of Ultra first came out and was declassified by the government, we've all followed the astounding successes in intelligence, cryptanalysis, history and secrecy of Bletchley Park and what they did. It was an amazing triumph. The secrecy was an amazing triumph. My aunt worked at Bletchley Park. She died a few weeks ago, and she worked there on one of the Colossus bombs as an operator. And they were told, you don't tell anybody ever about anything you've ever done here, ever. She chose the day of my mother's funeral, which was, as one can imagine, was a slightly less than joyful occasion, to sidle up to me afterwards as I was helping serve the food and said, "Oh, Christian, I know you're actually working on something about Enigma, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, actually, Aunt Elizabeth, I am. Can I catch you in a minute?" She said, "Oh, you know I worked at Bletchley, don't you?" And I said, "Ah, yes, thank you for waiting 70 years to tell me that." And the secrecy was an amazing accomplishment. But nobody has ever thought, what were the Germans doing? Max Hastings, the great British historian, turned around and wrote a few years ago, remains one of the unanswered questions of the Second World War, how a society, how a culture, how a regime as technologically advanced as the Third Reich, as the Germans, didn't match the British and the Americans head for head, code for code, achievement for achievement. Why not? The answer is they did, and they didn't. And the reason why they succeeded and why they failed were very different from the reasons why Bletchley Park, for instance, succeeded, and why the cracking of Enigma was so important. And I read this quote from Max Hastings and thought, I bet somebody very, very, very clever and very capable has written that book about every single thing the Germans were doing in terms of cryptanalysis for before the Second World War. And I realized that nobody had. And when you look at a challenging, seemingly insurmountable psychological, intellectual, professional, cultural, social problem, i.e. fun, you think, it hasn't been done because it's impossible, it hasn't been done because it's not true, it hasn't been done because it's not worth it, it hasn't been done because it's not interesting. And in the field of publishing and putting things out there and doing what we all do, sharing things with people who want to know things for a variety of reasons, you've got to get it right. You've got to get it right, especially if you're doing it the first time. So I had a look around and realized that nobody had done it, apart from two extremely capable cryptanalysts, one of whom had their own blog, which is complex to say the least, and then realized where all the information was. The information was in the National Security Agency in the United States. And there starts the story. When the Germans surrendered in 1945, the British and the Americans, particularly the Americans, sent in to Germany and Austria behind their advancing armies, literally behind in the footsteps of them, research teams who were looking for four things. They wanted to know about avionics, they wanted to know about rockets, they wanted to know about biological and chemical warfare, but they wanted to know about code breaking. They wanted to know what the Germans had known about our code breaking, Bletchley Park, the Americans cracking Japanese codes. They wanted to know what the Germans had been up to, how they'd done it, what they'd done, and they wanted their technology, and they wanted their people. The teams came from what was called the Target Intelligence Committee, TICOM as it was known with an abbreviation, who were, if it had been now, it would have been people like all of you. It would have been possibly people like me, but more likely people like you, who were reserve officers, people who were in uniform but were technicians, scientists, engineers, people who fought with their brains. And they were told, right guys, you're going into Germany as the war is just shuddering to an end, into the dying heartland of the Third Reich, and you're going to find these German code breakers. You're going to find what they did and find out how they not only nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic, but did things that nobody's ever admitted. The Royal Navy never turned around and admitted ever, except in secret, that the Germans have been reading their codes across the world since 1934. When everybody says, Bletchley, Enigma, Ultra. If it hadn't been for that, we would have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. England would have starved, we would have lost the Second World War, and the European Union would be German. Not necessarily true. You read internal intelligence documents written by the British themselves, and you look at what the German code breakers said. You go through, you analyse one U-boat battle against one convoy for a number of weeks. You look at all of the signals sent by the Americans and each U-boat and each Allied ship. You cross-matrix them into a vector of information about who knew what when, and you see at every single point, in every single engagement in the Battle of the Atlantic, for 14 key months in the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans knew where every Allied ship was, where it was coming from, where it was going to, what it was carrying when it left New York or Halifax, when it arrived in the United Kingdom. And in my book, it's colourful, it's written through the eyes of the people who are there. There's a Canadian destroyer officer who's guarding a convoy, and he's been told secretly by a British naval officer, listen, there is a slight problem. The Germans have read our codes and they do know when we're coming, so it might make things slightly harder for you. And he's like, great. And he's guarding a convoy and he knows the Germans are coming. And the Germans are reading his codes and they have no idea, the Canadians, the Allies, are not reading the Germans. There were huge periods of time when Bletchley Park was not reading Triton or Shark or the different German Enigma settings at all. Months went by when they were, the famous word, blind to Shark, the setting used by most of the Type 7C U-boats out in the Atlantic. And the British came far, far, far closer to losing the Battle of the Atlantic than I'll ever admit. And the Germans came far, far closer to winning it than we will probably ever know. And the people who told us this information were the Germans themselves. When these American and British intelligence analysts went into Germany, they didn't know very much. It was like taking all of you in this room and saying, guys, go and find the secrets of how the internet works, and it's sitting in a desert somewhere, and you've just got to go and find it. And this is what they were operating in Germany. They knew that half of the German Wehrmacht High Command cryptanalytical documents, machinery had been dumped into an Austrian lake. Which lake, when, how deep? But the Americans and the British had many things at their disposal in 1945, one of which was massive resources, engineering, money, people. And they thought, right, we'll go and dredge every single lake in Bavaria until we find it. They got lucky first time with the first lake, which helped. And they were also helped in many ways by the Teutonic Germanic nature of doing things, which is even when the Germans are trying to destroy their own property, they do it very, 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 very tidily and make sure that the documents are kept dry in nice boxes before they put them in the lake. And rather like now, when you discover there's huge amounts of information in the German Foreign Ministry archives about what the Allies and the Germans did about code-breaking, stuff that most normal governments would have destroyed sort of years ago. Nope, the Germans hang on to it, even though it's deeply shaming to them. It has to be kept. So these British soldiers, these British officers went into Germany, and to cut a very long story short, which is in the book, they captured most of the German codebreakers. They particularly caught one guy called Wilhelm Tranau, who's one of the heroes. He was the German Alan Turing. In 1914, in the First World War, he was serving on a German Navy ship, which received a message in the middle of the night. He was just a junior technician in the signals room, and he read it, he cracked it without even, he understood exactly what it was and sent a reply, thinking, great, I'm going to get promoted. He was totally bollocked and told never ever to go anywhere near it again. He realized very quickly after the end of the First World War, where the British captured German code books, that you shouldn't rely on a code book. It can be captured, it can be compromised, and you need machines. Machines can be changed, machines can be added to, modified. Another rotor can be put on the Enigma. The Enigma can be, a machine is something that can be used to promote, to ally, to deceive. If your enemies think you've got a machine that is magical, they'll try to negotiate their way around how to kind of decrypt a machine, and you can just slip sideways and start using code books again, which is what the Germans did with the Russians. And in the early 1920s, a man called Arthur Scherbius, a German engineer, invented something that he called the Enigma Machine. And he saw in the Germany and Europe pulling itself out of the economic doldrums after the First World War, that banks were going to need secret ways of transferring money or sending messages. So he invented this machine that looked like a kind of big typewriter. And he went round all of the different German government ministries, the Navy, the Army, and everybody, and said, hey guys, what about this for our signals? They all said, no, 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 it's too expensive, we can't afford it, we're not allowed to buy any war equipment under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Oh, actually, we might take this. Let's have a look. So from the get-go, from the mid-20s, the Germans were equipping themselves with machinery. By the mid-1930s, the Germans were rearming, they were redesigning their air force, their navy. They were 20 years ahead of the Allies in the late 1930s. They all had Enigma machines ready to go before the invasion of Poland. They allied this to very basic, very sensible signals intelligence technology, where as radio developed, the ability to listen to it developed too. And what the Germans did is they were totally and utterly ruthless about the whole thing, in many ways before the war rather than in it. They set up signals listening stations in every single country they possibly could. Spain during the Spanish Civil War, so they could listen to places in North Africa. North Africa, so they could listen to places in the Atlantic. They tried to pay the Irish government so they could set up signals listening stations in Ireland. They tried the same thing in Portugal as well. Greece, they did it. Italy, all over Germany. Any country where they had any allies or anything, they were listening. And they started listening to everything. They weren't just that interested in the Allies, in the Americans or the British or the French. Primarily they were. But they were totally non-selective. Sitting in the archives of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs now, it's on an Excel spreadsheet because it's Germany. And there are 3,917 items exactly. And the Excel spreadsheet isn't quite full, and you can see that the German who's done the Excel spreadsheet has really wanted to get to 4,000, but he hasn't. And it's a whole lot of stuff that the Germans had taken, stolen, burgled, beaten out of people, compromised, robbed in the decade before the Second World War. There's a code book from Guatemala. There's an Afghan code book from 1945. There are the military, diplomatic, Air Force, Foreign Office codes of every single country in South America, where the Germans were running Operation Bolivar, which was a German network of agents in South America preparing for the Germans to move to South America if they needed to in a hurry, which they did. And all of this stuff came from the TICOM mission in 1945, where these American and British officers captured these German codebreakers. And going back to the man I mentioned earlier, Wilhelm Tranau, the naval codebreaker, who saw the necessity for machines adopted the Enigma machines for German battleships and particularly submarines, and saw the necessity for codes that couldn't be broken by the enemy. And what he did was he started looking at the Royal Navy's codes in 1933, 34, 35, and the Royal Navy did three things wrong with their codes. They used codes that were too simple. They used too simple codes all of the time, and they used too simple codes all of the time that they didn't change. Code breakers, absolute dream. And they were British as well. They weren't just British, they were English. It was the Royal Navy. Britannia ruled the waves, and Britannia wanted everybody to know it ruled the waves. And the British had a habit, doesn't surprise any of us, of sending the same messages in the same way, terribly politely. Instead, the German message would just be battleship sighted, locational details, northwest Tangiers, 0430, and then the Enigma setting would be changed 10 minutes later. Some of the British signals that I've read that were decoded read like sort of letters, like good morning. I'd like to say, and the British were absolutely convinced that these were rock solid, rock tight. Nobody can break a substitution code. A substitution code, as I'm sure all of you can imagine, is absolutely the easiest thing to possibly break, which is where A, B, C, D is just substituted for X, Y, Z. And then the letters, the alphabet, move along each other like that. Or you do a double substitution, a transposition, where you have three lines of the alphabet, all of which move in different ways. The Royal Navy thought that was really complicated. The Germans thought it was really easy. And the Italians thought it was so easy, it took the Italians 2 weeks to break all of the Royal Navy's codes before the Second World War, done by one department sitting in Rome. And the Italians, when it came to writing this book, very keen to tell you about things like that. They've kept all of them. They've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of the Royal Navy's codes sitting in a basement in a museum in Rome. And you wonder, reading this stuff, how did Britain not lose the war? The Germans knew what we were doing before we blinked. It was extraordinary. And they did it by setting up, by listening, by gathering information, by inventing machines themselves so they could communicate with each other without anybody else knowing about it, the Enigma machine. And they saw that the British particularly, with a reliance on code books that went, and the British were relying on code books and not machines till 1943. After the British and the Americans discovered that their principal naval cipher was compromised in 2 convoy battles in the Atlantic in March 1943, where the Germans' 42 U-boats happened to converge on 2 convoys in the middle of the night in a storm 400 miles south of Greenland, and devastated 2 convoys. And the Germans knew every single ship was going and had come from. It was like that film, which I'm sure some or all of you have seen, Das Boot, which is the best German submarine film. It was that times 50 in horrible, horrible, horrible conditions. And the Allies realized after that, finally, I think they knew we were coming, and they certainly did. After that, the Allies still waited for several more convoys to be chopped to pieces, and then 6 months later changed their codes. It was partly because they thought nobody knew that they had broken Enigma. They had managed to decrypt Enigma. And to keep that secret, they were prepared never ever to mention information in material that came from Enigma in any of their messages elsewhere. Guarding the intelligence goose that laid the golden Enigma egg was far more important in many cases than using the tactical benefits of their own intelligence. They unwittingly sacrificed a lot to guard that secret for sometimes massive benefit, sometimes for negligible benefit. And the Germans, again, were successful because their technology was good, their capacity to listen was excellent. They were totally ruthless. If they wanted something, they would buy it, they would burgle it, they would beat it out of somebody, they would kidnap somebody, or they would kill somebody. They took everything from all of the countries they occupied. The material in this book comes from the TICOM archives, the interviews with these German codebreakers and the material that was captured. It comes from the paperwork that the Third Reich left behind in its empire. Go to every archive, every museum, every small town in Croatia, in northern Italy, in Slovenia, in France, in Austria. There's something there the Germans left behind. Stuff that's in the United States and in Britain or in Germany that is digitalized, archived, guarded. You have to ask to see it. You walk into an Italian museum, as I've done often, and just there'll be somebody there who quite often won't know how to use a computer, and everything will be in cardboard boxes. And this happened to me in Italy a few years ago. He said, yes, the original Gestapo deportation order for the people from town X to concentration camp. Yeah, I think we have it in this box here. History is out there, it's living, it's breathing, and it's easy to find if you know how to do it. And the material from this came from places like that in Italy and Croatia and across Germany's former empire. And when the Germans had been captured by the Americans and the British and Americans took these German codebreakers and their machinery back to Britain, back to America, and said, here's the deal, it's simple. Tell us every single thing you did, how you did it. And if you're really lucky, you can come and work for us in America, because we don't want you to go and work for the Russians. The speed with which allies and enemies shifted sides in 1945 was extraordinarily fast. It went from, 1 week the Germans were on the other side. A month later, the Americans were asking them to come and work for them. And many of the American intelligence and codebreaking triumphs in the 50s came from these Germans that they employed in 1945 onwards. And the Americans and the British took these people and this machinery and painstakingly, over 4 years of interrogations, interviews, mechanically piecing together the scientific archaeology of the Third Reich's cryptanalytical apparatus. They saw what the Germans had been doing and they interviewed all of them. And there are tens of thousands of these pages of interviews tapped out by some American sergeant clerk on a typewriter in a barn in Bavaria in May 1945, with the war just over, and the guy's been sent to Europe for the first time out of the States in his life, and he's sitting in a barn and he's going, and then the Royal Navy's codes proved remarkably easy to break. Page after page after page of this. It's very, very interesting research to do. A lot of it's online, a lot of it's findable online if you know where to look and you have the time to read 17,000 pages of grey typewriter script from 1945 without going blind. And I worked out on this book the ratio of pages read to information used was 110 to 1, and you can read through page after page of these interviews and there's nothing new, there's nothing at all. And then it's something that all of you would recognize instantly from the jobs you do, from what you're so good at. There's that one sentence where scientist X says to naval officer Y, yes, we got that message from the Americans in Gibraltar that the Poles had already known about Enigma before. Brackets, country house in Buckinghamshire, Bletchley, ? Pencil, crossed out heavily by a censor. And then another interview. Then the Americans went back and back and back to these people. And then you realize halfway through the interviews, once you've read all of them and you've got the 15 main characters in this book, you realize that who was playing the game and who was the game playing. Were the Germans telling the Americans what they wanted to know, or the Americans doing it the other way around? Wilhelm Tranau, the crack naval cryptanalyst, you read every single page of information you can find in the world about that man, and at the end the Americans didn't know how he did it. He kept them, he strung them along forever. He then disappears after the war for 3 years and then comes back alive in Hamburg after the war, running the German National Press Agency supported by the British. It's a wonderfully mysterious story. I'm convinced he left everything in his diary to his secretary, which is somewhere in the United States, but I couldn't find it. And the Germans then, having listened, having used these wonderful machines, having deceived the Allies, having set up Enigma, you would have thought the obvious. They would have suspected that the Americans and the British could have cracked the Enigma codes and decrypted them. Germans never, they suspected, but they never knew. They could never prove it. The brilliant, bright, scientific brains were always saying we cannot rely on machines. Anything that man makes, man can break. And they were always saying we have to change the number of rotor settings on the Enigma machine, on every U-boat, every ship, every hour, every day. It proved insurmountably complicated. The Third Reich listened to its enemies, but it didn't listen to itself. When it came to listening to its own experts, it had its fingers in its ears. And the difference between the Third Reich and the British and the Americans was that we were working in a single monolinear forward-moving way for a democracy. The Germans were moving in a circle for a dictatorship. The Germans also divided their code-breaking efforts into 10 different agencies, which often duplicated each other's efforts. Imagine if all of you in this room, every single job you do, every hour of the day, is being done similarly, slightly less well, by 10 other people you don't like in an office, basically run by the same organization but at loggerheads with you, which is defeating and deleting every single thing you do every single moment. That's how the Germans worked. The foreign ministry suspected the army. The army suspected the air force. Goering didn't like Himmler. Himmler didn't like Hitler. Hitler didn't like anybody. And it was not a conducive environment to produce true things where the people who needed to know these true things and act on intelligence did something about it. And when the Germans were winning, and in the Battle of the Atlantic, Russia, the invasion of Europe, their knowledge about intelligence, their knowledge of code breaking was brilliant. When the wheels started to come off, it didn't matter how good the information was. In Russia, once the Russians started going on the offensive, it didn't matter what they knew about the Russians, what the Russians were going to do next, because if 250,000 men and 2,000 tanks come at you through the snow, doesn't really matter if a clever man has said they might go through the forest there or down the road there. They're just going to arrive. But the other thing that the Germans did wrong is when they knew something, it went to the wrong people. They did nothing about it. In the first day, the day after the invasion of Normandy, on the 7th of June 1944, the Germans discovered a deserted landing craft in a river on the Norman coast near Utah Beach. In it was all of the code settings for the portable coding machines, encryption machines carried by the 101st and 82nd Airborne Division. The Germans knew what the American airborne divisions in Normandy were going to be doing for 7 days after the invasion, but they could do nothing about it. They didn't have the tanks, the men, the strategic or tactical flexibility to enable them to use this intelligence. And on other occasions where everybody was listening to everybody else and taking everybody's intelligence, the Waffen-SS were buying decrypted intelligence material from the Hungarians and taking it from them as well. And they wanted this because the Hungarians were listening to the signals of two important countries. One, Finland, where the language is very similar to Hungarian, and the other one was the Turks. The Turks were listening to all of the proceedings at the Yalta Conference, where the future of post-war Europe was being decided in February 1945. The Turks knew exactly what was going on. The Hungarians were listening to the Turks. The Germans were taking what the Hungarians had, and it was going back straight to Hitler. You follow this chain of information where, despite the fact that the war is ending, the Third Reich is finished, and half the Nazis of any shape, size, power and demeanor were heading as fast as they could for South America, Hitler's still convinced that the war can somehow be won. And this surprise bit of information arrives. This is what Stalin and Churchill, and this is what the Americans and Russians, this is how they're going to carve up Europe and how we're going to be carved up. It gets to Hitler. And this is an occasion where in the research for this book you plough through page after page after page knowing there's going to be one line. And one American has recorded one German who saw Hitler's reaction to this information, this decrypted intelligence arrived. And it's just written in German. So you find your German translator helps you out. And Hitler looks at this information about the Yalta Conference, referring to his head of army code breaking. He turns around and says, in German, basically, this motherfucker needs to go and get another job and kind of improve his life skills. Totally refused to believe it. Other occasions, the people who worked for the SS and for Goering sometimes would decrypt information, diplomatic signals in Berlin. There was a woman, extremely good woman in Berlin, Ursula Hagen, who was decrypting every single day the diplomatic signal sent by the Portuguese, Irish and French embassies, I think it was, before lunchtime every single day. And her information would be passed to the foreign ministry, to the different parts of the German cryptanalytical community. Very often, though, the people who received it, the mid-ranking junior staff, would have a bit of paper which said, things not going very well in North Africa, suggest retreat. And they're like, anybody want to go and give this to Heinrich Himmler? And there are bits where, so, head of department, put it in the dustbin. The human factor in Germany was as much a defeating factor as the scientific factor was a triumph for the Allies. At the end of it, the Germans lost because they didn't have the strategic and tactical materials to put their intelligence gains into action. The Allies won because they could keep a secret and the Germans couldn't. And after the war, all the secrets came out, all of these thousands of pages of documents, internal reports from the Americans and the British about how the Battle of the Atlantic really nearly went far more wrong than we thought it was. All of this was hidden away. It was put in archives in the United States, declassified. It's still being declassified now. I started looking at it 4 or 5 years ago. And it's out there online, and it's tens of thousands of pages are still there to be declassified. I've touched the tip of an enormous iceberg. I've touched the tip of it, possibly not very well, possibly not very interestingly, but I've touched it, which nobody else had really done, apart from a few experts. And there's a massive story that waits to be told. This is the beginning, and it's not a technical, algebraic, mathematical book, because I'm not a mathematician, I'm not very good at algebra. In fact, much of the technical stuff in it was checked by people who are good at it, much better than I am. But it's a human book. It's about the people who did it. And it's new. It tells the story from the other side. It tells all the things that we didn't know because we haven't been told them, but have been waiting there. And for people who want to go and find out, who are curious and investigative, it's sitting there. And the more you read about it, when the Germans were decrypting and listening to the codes of 41 different nationalities in 41 different languages, you find the documents. I could do the documents in French, Italian, Spanish, bit of Croatian, and English. I had friends doing Greek, Polish, Russian, and Romanian. And the more you read, the more it comes together. And this paperback edition is updated, for instance, with details of what the Finns were doing and what the Poles were doing. The Poles cracked Enigma before the war. They gave the information to the British. The British pretended that they did it, and the Poles were shifted sideways. The Poles also told the Germans in interrogations that they'd cracked Enigma and that Enigma was compromised, and the Germans didn't listen. The Germans knew that Enigma was compromised at the very beginning of the war, but the information wasn't passed upwards. The people who needed to know weren't told. The people who knew didn't need to know and couldn't do anything about it. It was about every single thing that all of you do, that we all do. It's about flow of information, taking information, making sure it's right, but making sure that the people who need to have it, who can optimize its executive use, have it as quickly as possible. And much better to have a little bit that is true than everything that is true late. And that's how it ended. And the story kind of continues at the end of the war when these people were captured by the Americans and the British, and the whole story started from there, and it became the story of cryptanalysis in the whole of the Cold War and the face-off with Russia, which continued for decades and decades afterwards. So again, I would emphasize that this is, I've just touched the tip of the iceberg here, but it's the first time it's been done, and first time it's been done comprehensively in English with one big overview. Much to my delight, people profoundly cleverer and better writers and who know more about the subject than I ever will have said nice things about the book. Normally what happens when you write a book is that popular critics, newspapers, online, people who buy and read books say, oh, this is a great book, this is fun, I liked it. Oh, this book is, I didn't like it. It's sort of, subjective criticism. I was, for 17 years, a war correspondent in Africa and the Balkans. Then I write books about modern history and popular science and forensic science. And I live in Turin in Italy. I'm not a mathematician, I don't know anything about codes. So writing this, you think, yes, it was yes, it was checked by people who know, but I'm going to have made mistakes. And to my absolute delight, people who know this world, the people who build Enigma machines in their attics still, who write for Cryptologia magazine, said that it was more or less right. So it was very, very nice to hear indeed. And let me just check. 20 minutes. Great. In which case I'll leave you with one quick anecdote that shows how codes were broken. Before the war, the Germans wanted to know what the Romanians were doing with their oil. The Romanians had a lot of oil. The Germans wanted it to invade Russia and Europe. They wanted Romania as an ally, or somebody they could bludgeon into being an ally, so they could get their oil. The Germans didn't have access to oil in the Caucasus without invading Russia. They couldn't go to the Middle East because the British controlled the Suez Canal. And they needed Romanian oil, a lot of it, and they needed it fast. And they needed to know what the Romanians were going to do with their oil, so they needed to crack the Romanian military, diplomatic, naval, air force, everything codes. What they did was the Romanian embassy in Paris decided one evening to give an evening of classical music, a gala of classical music. Why did the Romanians decide to do this? Because their arch rivals and diplomatic sparring partners, the Hungarians, had had a gala evening of classical music, and the Romanians wanted to look as good as the Hungarians. So Bucharest said to the embassy in Paris, guys, what did the Hungarians have on their list of classical music? We really need to do better. So the duty clerk at the Romanian embassy in Paris sent back to Bucharest, in the military and diplomatic code, the list of the Hungarian musical soiree, dutifully written out. But then he got a couple of figures wrong. He said this was for the 17th of April or the 17th of March or the 17th of February, when it should have been for another month. So Bucharest then said, please send the entire list again. Codebreakers' dream. The code's settings had changed in between the two transmissions of exactly the same information. So Beethoven's Sonata X ... appeared in two different code settings. The Germans cracked it. They used that straight into the entire Romanian cryptanalytical infrastructure, cracked every single Romanian code on the basis of that, and knew that the Romanians would give them their oil and side with Germany because they didn't want to be crushed and invaded. It worked rather well. And just before I take questions, this has led on to writing one book, doing one investigation leads on to another. I'm now doing a book about the hunt for the world's last, most wanted, possibly still alive Nazis, who are dying at the rate of knots, as you can imagine. In fact, most of them are already gone. These are all men from one SS division who carried out massive reprisals against civilians in Tuscany in Italy in 1944. Half of the civilians massacred by the Germans in Italy in the Second World War, the massacres were carried out by one Waffen-SS division, all of whom got away with murder. And for a variety of reasons, deals done between the SS and the Allies after the war, German refusal to extradite people, deal with war criminals, every single thing that has prevented a whole list of guilty SS men happily living at liberty in Germany from being sent back to face justice in Italy for war crimes that included the massacre of a village of 560 civilians, where of the dead, 80 were under 16. One of them was a baby of 3 weeks old. I was in this village 3 weeks ago talking to people who were children at the time who survived. And this next book is the story of that hunt, the story of what happened to these SS men, the story of the village, the story of these survivors and how they fought for justice. And it follows on from this World War II investigation. It's called The Olive Trees Screamed Murder. And we'll see what happens with it. We're not sure yet if there are any of these German SS men still alive. The last one died in March, who was the world's most wanted living Nazi, who died in freedom, untouched, in a nursing home in Hamburg, unrepentant. So it's the next book to look out for. On that note, I'm sure what you have to ask me will be far more interesting than anything I've said. So anybody got any questions? Thank you. Just wait for the microphone.
In your list of source material, you didn't mention any British documents. Would I be right in thinking that...
Sorry, start again.
In your list of source material you've looked at, I didn't hear you mention any British documents. Would I be right in thinking that the British crypto systems, even from 75 years ago, are still classified?
I looked at a lot of British documents. I didn't mention them specifically because most of them aren't new, most of them are in the public domain, and most of them have come out in the telling of the story of Bletchley Park and Enigma. The more in-depth ones about how the British were involved with the Americans in the cracking of Japanese codes, for instance. Most of this was piggybacked onto American stuff, American material as well. The majority of the British documentation that's held in archives in the UK is largely known. Bletchley Park I was there last year, it's a national triumph. It's every single thing it should be. So any material that is there that clarifies and illuminates and aggrandizes its extraordinary achievements has already been declassified and put out there. The British material that hasn't been seen tends not to be in Britain. It's in Italian archives, it's in German archives, it's in Croatia, it's in Finland. It's in places where the British sort of probably would prefer that it wasn't. Yes?
So you mentioned one of the codes that the British used that was very easy for the Germans to crack, the Naval Codes. Were there any codes that for the Germans were very difficult to crack and have sort of a story behind the cryptographic process, much like we had with, say, the Lorentz cipher, where there's a whole saga of developing the Colossus machine?
Very, very good question. Yes, a substantial number of the British codes were quite straightforward for the Germans to break, but a substantial number of them weren't. And the advanced naval codes, some of the Air Force codes as well, the Germans were hamstrung in trying to decrypt them effectively all of the time because they didn't have enough people to do it. Churchill threw huge resources at Bletchley Park. Whatever they wanted, they got. The Germans were, by 1943, there's a very good diary entry of some of these German army code breakers who were trying to break British codes. and they haven't got enough people to do it. They haven't got enough material. They're sitting in buildings that have been bombed, where the radiators aren't working, and there's plaster dust sitting on everything, wearing mittens, writing in pencil by candles, and they haven't had enough to eat, and they can't concentrate, they can't get it right. They found a lot of the British codes difficult to do and difficult to decrypt, partly because of the sheer volume of them, because as the war moved forward, there were more Allied soldiers doing more things in more places more often each day, generating far more signals, and this is what slowed the Germans up. Not specifically any blindingly difficult codes, just the absolute volume of them. The best German success, though, in decrypting Allied codes was the Italians burgled the American embassy in Rome and stole the code book of the American military attaché and copied it, went back into the embassy a few hours later, put it back in the safe. The head of Italian military intelligence had the keys to every embassy in Rome apart from the Russian one. They opened the gates, they walked into the embassy, they opened the safe, they took the code book out, they photographed it, put it back in. The Americans didn't realise. And the American military attaché at their embassy in Cairo, for 8-9 months, a colonel called Bonifellas would send information back to Washington using this code that the Germans were listening to, describing every single thing that he knew about what the Allies were doing in North Africa. So much so that Rommel joked that by lunchtime each day he would know where to put his tanks because of what this American colonel was sending back to Washington. The British rumbled him, the Americans rumbled him, the Germans sent messages that the Allies cracked saying this guy was gassing his mouth off at every turn, every day to Washington. The ironic nature of war, he was promoted to a general and decorated.
Yes. So are there any lasting technological effects of the German code-breaking effort? Because if we look at the British code-breaking efforts, obviously the Colossus and the various related machinery there were then later used as demonstrator projects for general-purpose computing. Alan Turing then went on to Cambridge, developed the EDSAC, the Manchester Baby, things like that. Are there any parallels for the German code-breaking efforts? Did their developments then go on to inspire further technology?
The Germans' technology, and this is as far as I know, there's big areas of this I won't know about, in code breaking went into two areas. One was it transferred over into rocket technology in the early 1950s, and it was specifically used to help the Americans in their intelligence battle against Russian spying operations in the United States in the end of the 40s and the 50s. In terms of technical material, there was nothing after the cracking of the Lorentz cipher and after Enigma its settings had been decrypted. There was nothing physically technological that the Germans developed that the Allies hadn't already somersaulted over, because by about 1943 no German tech, apart from small arms, some tanks and V1 and V2 rockets, there wasn't enough raw materials, money or time for the Germans to sit down and invent computers, which is of course that's something they could have done had they had the space. They were being bombed every day by the Americans. There's a great story in one document I read where a bunch of new code breakers arrive at Bletchley Park and they're told, listen, here's your test. If you don't pass this test, well, you're going back to the army, you're going back to university, you're going back to work in a hospital, but you're not up to the job. The German version is slightly different, where a bunch of aspiring code breakers are sitting having an exam, and an officer, a German cryptanalytical officer from the German army, sits in front of them and says, here's your admissions test. I know you all want to be cryptanalysts, 90% of you will fail this test. 10% of you will pass. The 10% who pass will become code breakers. The 90% of you who fail will go to Russia. There was incentive to pass. But they were working in their development of radio signals, intelligence, everything, it kind of slowed to a halt about 1943 because they had their backs against the wall, fighting a losing war. So the answer to your question is not very much, no. Gentleman here.
You mentioned how the Allies were very nervous about letting the Germans know they'd broken their codes from, was it 43, 44, around the time. Was there any kind of difference in the different nations at war in willingness to utilize information they'd learnt and therefore potentially jeopardize the fact that they'd broken the codes? Were some countries kind of more willing to take tough ethical decisions than others and hamper their war efforts through those ethical decisions?
Very good question. The Finns, very good code breakers, started off fighting a civil war in Finland where one sided part of the Finns sided with Russia, the other sided with Germans. The pro-German side won. The Finns, throughout the Second World War, were not just playing all sides against the middle, they were playing the middle against all sides too. And they were selling material to the Swedes and to the Japanese defense attaché at the Japanese embassy in Stockholm at the same time as giving it to the Brits and the Americans and the Germans. Meanwhile, all of this information was a lot of it was Russian, was being decrypted by each side as well. So when the Americans who were listening to Japanese codes, or cracking Japanese codes, discovered that the Japanese knew they were doing this, it was through the fact that the Finns had told the Japanese. The more you read into it, the more you're surprised that anybody had any secrets at all. But there were a couple of nationalities who were so good at it. The Hungarians were very good. The Finns were absolute masters of kind of compromising everybody against each other. Anybody else?
Is there a question over here?
I guess it's more of an organizational observation. The Germans seemed to have a lead in just the sheer volume of signal intelligence that they were collecting relative to European counterparts. When did that have established this good organizational structure to allow, you were saying, a small piece of truth coming up to the executives rather than, or was that the impediment, or is it because of the German leadership coming in, kind of turning that upside down kind of thing?
Again, very good question. The Germans established a very, very good, effective system for gathering information and disseminating the information, and did that in many cases before the war. And it worked brilliantly when they were winning, and when the generals who were winning and the leaders who were winning trusted the people on the ground who were winning, and therefore the intelligence, as the tanks arrived in town X, they then believed the intelligence that 2 days before had said that the French will retreat from here. As successively their intelligence was proved correct in the invasion of Russia on Operation Barbarossa, or what the Spanish were going to do, or what the British were doing with the convoy in the Mediterranean, or what the Americans were saying about North Africa. As each thing was proved to be true, the German leadership, the German generals and Hitler's coterie believed their code breakers and encouraged them and recruited more of them, made them better at their job, increased their intelligence gathering structure. The moment defeat came along and the moment the terrible reality of things called facts started to contradict the Germans' belief in their own kind of inassailable intelligence, then things started to go wrong because the established infrastructure was just attacked from within.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was fascinating.
Thank you all for listening.